Valentine's Day in Fort Valley should have been filled with love. Instead, it ended in silence. When 23-year-old Anitra Gunn vanished that February morning, what began as a weekend of affection turned into one of Georgia's most heartbreaking crimes. A case that would expose the dark reality hidden behind a familiar smile. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. Fort Valley, Georgia, sat quietly in the center of Peach County, surrounded by endless pecan groves and two-lane roads that shimmered under the southern sun. On most mornings, you could smell roasted peanuts from nearby farms and hear the faint whistle of passing freight trains. Life there moved slow, deliberate, predictable, the kind of place where people waved from their porches, and the college campus was the heartbeat of the community. Among those students was Anitra Gunn, a Fort Valley State University senior studying agriculture, ambitious, kind, and endlessly giving. Friends said she carried warmth wherever she went, the kind of smile that disarmed strangers and the energy that pulled people closer. She was known for her creative spirit, always sketching designs for her future business ideas or helping friends with class projects. To her professors, she was focused and reliable. To her classmates, she was the one who lifted spirits when exam stress wore them down. Born in 1996, Anitra came from a close-knit family in Clayton County. Her father, Christopher Gunn, was deeply involved in her life, proud, protective, the kind of parent who attended every milestone. Her stepmother and cousins often spoke about her laughter, that it had a rhythm of its own, loud and unguarded. Anitra wanted more than anything to finish college, find stability, and build something lasting. Maybe a home, maybe a career that tied her to the earth she studied. But even the most promising lives can hide fractures beneath the surface. In the months leading to 2020, those close to her noticed subtle changes. Late-night phone calls that ended in tears, brief silences when her boyfriend's name came up. She was dating DeMarcus Little, a young man who had also attended Fort Valley State University. At first, they seemed happy, a campus couple with shared ambitions. But as the relationship matured, tension began to show. Friends later recalled that Anitra sometimes appeared anxious, that she once joked about needing a break from the drama. Then came the incidents. A smashed window, a slashed tire, small but troubling signs that things were unraveling. Local police took reports, yet no one could have predicted how those acts of anger would foreshadow what was coming. Anitra never stopped trying to see the good in people. She remained optimistic, steadying herself with schoolwork, church, and close friends who kept her grounded. Her online presence reflected that steadiness. Her last visible social media activity, a cheerful post about finishing a class assignment and looking forward to the weekend, came just days before she vanished. Nothing in her messages or photos hinted at danger. To her friends, that ordinary post became haunting in retrospect, the final glimpse of a life still intact. When February 14th arrived, the air over Fort Valley was cool and clear. Heart-shaped balloons bobbed outside flower shops, and students hurried across campus with gifts tucked under their arms. Anitra's friends expected to see her that morning. When she didn't respond to texts or calls, they brushed it off at first. Maybe she was spending the day with DeMarcus. But by evening, unease began to set in. "She never went a day without texting us back," one friend told reporters later. That silence, it just didn't make sense. By the next morning, worry had turned to panic. Anitra missed class, and her phone still went straight to voicemail. Her father, unable to reach her, called around to friends and eventually decided to drive the 2 hours from Atlanta to Fort Valley himself. It was still early, the kind of cold Georgia dawn that paints everything in muted gray, when he pulled off State Route 49 and entered the quiet residential streets near the campus. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he slowed near a modest home where he knew DeMarcus sometimes stayed. That's when he saw it. Anitra's car, a white Chevy Cruze, parked awkwardly by the roadside, a section of its front bumper torn away as if it had scraped against something hard. Dust coated the windshield. there was no sign of his daughter. The morning was still, except for the distant hum of a tractor somewhere beyond the trees. Christopher Gunn stepped out, called her name into the cool air, and felt the first surge of fear tighten in his chest. He contacted local police immediately. Officers arrived and began processing the scene, photographing the car, noting the missing bumper, looking for footprints or signs of a struggle. Nothing obvious turned up, no blood, no discarded belongings, but to a father's eyes, the emptiness itself was evidence. Something had happened. Word spread quickly across campus and through town. By that afternoon, students were sharing Anitra's photo across social media, her bright smile now paired with the word missing. Neighbors printed flyers. Volunteers gathered at the local church to organize search teams. It was unthinkable that a young woman so embedded in daily life could vanish within sight of familiar streets. The Peach County Sheriff's Office began coordinating with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, bringing in more officers and equipment. Helicopters scanned over fields and tree lines. Search dogs traced scents through brush along rural roads. As daylight faded, hundreds of flashlights flickered across the countryside like restless stars. For those who loved her, each night without news felt heavier. The unanswered calls, the untouched textbooks in her apartment, the still-folded clothes on her bed, all silent witnesses to a life interrupted. Her father refused to leave town, visiting the police station daily, pressing for updates, joining every search. He told reporters, "My daughter's out there somewhere, and I'm not leaving until she's found." Days passed, and fear deepened. The flyers on telephone poles began to curl in the damp wind. The campus felt hollow. Conversations in coffee shops trailed into uneasy silence whenever her name came up. Fort Valley was a small place. Her disappearance wasn't just news, it was personal. Meanwhile, investigators turned to the one person who might hold answers, DeMarcus Little. He told police that he and Anitra had spent time together on February 13th, that she'd left early the next morning. He denied knowing where she'd gone. At first, officers treated him as a cooperating witness, but inconsistencies soon emerged, gaps in his timeline, discrepancies between his story and phone location data. Still, without a body, detectives were limited. They continued to search, hoping for a lead that would shift speculation into evidence. Anitra's friends and family clung to hope. They posted online updates, organized candlelight vigils, and begged anyone with information to step forward. Each evening, the soft glow of candles flickered outside the campus chapel, casting long shadows across posters of her face. The community prayed for her return, but beneath the prayers was a rising dread that this story might not end with a reunion. On the fourth day, searchers expanded into neighboring Crawford County, where the dense pine woods stretched for miles. The air was damp and cold, heavy with the smell of earth. A team walking along Greer Road, just outside Roberta, paused when they noticed something beyond a tree line. A patch of disturbed soil, a glimpse of fabric half buried in leaves. Moments later, radios crackled with urgency. Fort Valley's search had reached its heartbreaking end. The hope that had carried a community was replaced by silence once more, this time final, unrelenting. What could have happened that night to change everything so suddenly? The woods off Greer Road in Crawford County, Georgia, were quiet that February afternoon. The winter light filtered through thin pine branches, dappling the forest floor in patches of gold and gray. For days, volunteers and law enforcement had walked those same stretches, calling Anitra's name over and over, hoping for an answer. But on February 18, 2020, the search ended with the discovery no one wanted to make. Investigators from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation were called immediately to the scene. Yellow crime scene tape wound its way through the trees, snapping softly in the wind. Deputies stood guard, their faces solemn, while crime scene technicians worked methodically, every step measured, every photograph deliberate. Beneath the scattered pine needles and soil lay the remains of 23-year-old Anitra Gunn, partially covered, her clothing torn and dirt-stained. The stillness of the woods was broken only by the murmur of radios and the clicking of camera shutters. Officers who had spent the last 4 days searching side by side with Anitra's family lowered their heads in quiet disbelief. Some had children her age. Within the hour, word spread through Fort Valley. Social media flooded with posts, short, broken sentences of grief and disbelief. At Fort Valley State University, the campus that had once echoed with her laughter now felt like a memorial. Students gathered outside the student center hugging in silence. One student later said, "It felt like the whole world stopped for a second." Back in Crawford County, investigators worked quickly to preserve the scene. The area where Anitra's body was found was remote, just off a rural stretch of road bordered by thick brush and tall grass. It was about 18 miles from where her car had been discovered days earlier. That distance immediately raised questions. How did she end up here? Was she brought after death? Or did the attack happen nearby? Sheriff Terry Dees of Peach County confirmed publicly that the remains appeared to be Anitra's. Her father, Christopher Gunn, who had refused to leave Fort Valley since the search began, was notified in person. Reporters described him standing silently for several moments after hearing the words, then lowering his head into his hands. Later, he told a local station, "I wanted to believe she was still out there. I didn't want to think this was how it would end." The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, began processing the evidence. Every detail mattered: tire impressions on the nearby dirt path, footprints leading toward and away from the site, and fragments of debris caught on low branches. The early findings suggested the body had been there for several days. Weather conditions, cool nights and mild afternoons, had slowed decomposition, helping preserve crucial forensic clues. By the next morning, the case was no longer treated as a missing person investigation. It was now a homicide. Detectives turned their attention immediately to those closest to Anitra. Her social life, text messages, call history, and last known movements were combed through meticulously. One timeline began to take shape: the hours between the night of February 13th and the morning of February 14th, when she was last seen alive. According to phone records, Anitra and her boyfriend, DeMarcus Little, exchanged several messages late that night. Little, a U.S. Army soldier stationed at Fort Gordon in Augusta, had been visiting Fort Valley around that time. He told investigators that they'd spoken briefly and that she left his residence early the next morning. But investigators noticed inconsistencies. Cell tower pings showed both of their phones traveling along the same route in the early hours of Valentine's Day, a detail that contradicted parts of his statement. Meanwhile, friends recalled strange behavior from DeMarcus even before she disappeared. One friend told reporters that Anitra had confided about a prior argument that had turned physical. Another recalled that DeMarcus had allegedly damaged her property during a fight weeks earlier, incidents that were documented in police reports. As the search for answers deepened, investigators learned that Little had been arrested days earlier, before Anitra's body was even found, on unrelated charges of criminal damage to property. It was connected to the previous vandalism of Anitra's car and home. That arrest now seemed like more than a coincidence. When Anitra's body was discovered, he was still in custody. The timing was impossible to ignore. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Little's vehicle and personal belongings. Inside, they found items that would later prove significant, including traces of fabric fibers and biological evidence. Forensic testing began immediately at the GBI crime lab in Atlanta. Meanwhile, Anitra's autopsy revealed signs of homicidal violence. While authorities initially withheld exact details to preserve the investigation, later reports confirmed that the cause of death was strangulation, a brutal, intimate act that spoke volumes about the relationship between victim and killer. The discovery sent shockwaves through Georgia. For a community that had rallied in hope, the confirmation of murder was unbearable. Students organized a vigil at Fort Valley State University the night after the announcement. Hundreds gathered under a fading sunset, candles in hand. They sang hymns, prayed, and released balloons into the evening sky. A sea of flickering lights illuminated faces streaked with tears. Her father addressed the crowd briefly. "We'll get justice for Anitra. My baby didn't deserve this." His voice broke halfway through the sentence, the weight of loss crushing the last word into silence. While grief spread through Fort Valley, investigators pieced together the grim sequence of events. Surveillance footage from the night of February 13th placed Anitra's car near DeMarcus's home. Witnesses reported hearing raised voices earlier that evening. One neighbor claimed to have seen a white car leaving the area in the early morning hours, matching the description of Anitra's Chevy Cruze. Detectives also analyzed digital data, phone GPS records, text exchanges, and the timeline leading up to her disappearance. Patterns began to form. Moments of jealousy, attempts at control, and previous altercations that hinted at escalating violence. By February 22nd, just days after the discovery of her body, authorities announced that DeMarcus Little had been charged with murder. The press conference was brief and tense. Sheriff Dees confirmed that evidence gathered at multiple scenes, including digital data, witness statements, and forensic results, all pointed toward Little. "This is not the outcome we hoped for," he said, "but we are confident in the direction this investigation has taken." As news of the arrest spread, reactions were divided between shock and grim resignation. Those who knew Anitra and DeMarcus said their relationship had seemed normal from the outside, but others weren't surprised. One student told the media, "We saw the signs. She wanted to get out." She was trying. For Anitra's family, the arrest brought only partial relief. Her father made it clear that the charges, though necessary, could never fill the void. "Justice won't bring her back," he said, "but I'll make sure her story isn't forgotten." The following weeks saw an outpouring of community support. Fundraisers were launched to help the family with funeral expenses. The university announced plans for a scholarship in Anitra's name, dedicated to students studying agriculture, the field she had loved so deeply. Still, beneath the tributes, questions lingered. Had warning signs been missed? Could earlier intervention have saved her? Authorities continued to process evidence, preparing for trial, while the town of Fort Valley tried to heal. But the image of those quiet woods off Greer Road, where searchers stumbled upon the site that ended days of hope, would never leave those who had been there. And though an arrest had been made, the heartbreak remained raw. As the investigation unfolded, more layers of this tragic story began to emerge. Digital clues, testimonies, and the painful unraveling of a relationship that had turned fatal. What truly happened in those final hours between Valentine's Eve and the morning she disappeared? When the call came in confirming that DeMarcus Little was already in custody on unrelated charges, investigators in Peach and Crawford counties knew they needed to move carefully. The death of Anitra Gunn had shaken all of Middle Georgia, and now the focus was on building a case strong enough to stand up to both scrutiny and heartbreak. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation had already taken the lead. Agents from the GBI Region 13 office and specialists from the crime scene unit worked alongside the Peach County Sheriff's Office, piecing together a puzzle that spanned multiple counties, cell towers, and hours of digital data. Every photograph, every phone record, every vehicle trace mattered now. They began with the timeline. On February 13th, the night before Valentine's Day, Anitra had spent the evening with friends, attending a small gathering near campus. She was described as cheerful, texting intermittently, and planning a quiet Valentine's Day. By midnight, she texted a friend that she was headed home. That was the last confirmed communication from her phone. The next day, Valentine's morning, she missed calls, texts, and a class she never skipped. By early afternoon, concern turned into panic. Phone analysis placed her last known signal near Fort Valley's Everett Square area, not far from where DeMarcus lived. His phone, too, had pinged within the same vicinity around that time. To investigators, this wasn't conclusive proof, but it was the first thread tying him more closely to the disappearance. At the GBI Crime Lab in Atlanta, Forensic technicians were processing samples collected from both Anitra's car and DeMarcus's black Chevrolet Impala. The car, impounded earlier after his arrest, showed potential trace evidence. Technicians found faint biological residues, fibers, fingerprints, and cellular material, all logged and sealed. Investigators also examined Anitra's white Chevy Cruze, discovered days earlier abandoned in a remote area. The front bumper was torn off, the result of an apparent collision with an object. Paint transfer analysis indicated the damage matched fragments found near DeMarcus's neighborhood, reinforcing suspicions that her car had been deliberately damaged before being hidden. Meanwhile, detectives returned to the digital evidence. Anitra's last outgoing messages painted a tense picture. In one text to a friend, she mentioned wanting space and that things with her boyfriend had been difficult lately. Though vague, it aligned with witness accounts suggesting growing strain between the two. As days turned into weeks, the GBI's behavioral analysts reviewed the case. The nature of the crime, personal, close contact, and concealed, pointed strongly toward someone Anitra knew. Random violence rarely presented this way. Agents re-interviewed friends, classmates, and neighbors. One student recalled seeing Anitra's car parked near DeMarcus's house on the night of the 13th. Another mentioned overhearing a heated phone call days prior. These statements weren't conclusive, but painted a mosaic of tension and volatility. Back in Fort Valley, the community continued to grieve. Flyers of Anitra's face, once hopeful symbols during the search, now became reminders of loss. The campus counseling center reported a surge in students seeking support. Professors described her as diligent, ambitious, and kind. A student who had once written in a paper that she hoped to use agriculture to give back to rural communities. For the investigators, emotion couldn't overshadow process. They knew they had to build a case rooted in evidence, not outrage. During a search of DeMarcus Little's property, agents discovered items linking him directly to Anitra in the hours before her disappearance, including her personal belongings and data from his cell phone's GPS logs. According to warrants later unsealed in court, those logs showed movement patterns consistent with travel from Fort Valley to the rural area of Greer Road, where her body was eventually found. The pieces were aligning, but one question haunted detectives. When and how did the confrontation turn deadly? Anitra's autopsy confirmed manual strangulation, a deeply personal form of violence, typically committed by someone in an intimate relationship with the victim. No defensive wounds indicating a long struggle were found, suggesting the attack may have been sudden. In their reports, GBI investigators described a grim timeline. Sometime between the night of February 13th and the morning of February 14th, an argument escalated fatally. Her body was transported and left in the wooded area, concealed under light debris. The killer returned home, attempting to resume normal activity, even joining searches later that week. Public reaction intensified when these details surfaced in court records. News outlets across Georgia reported the tragic sequence. Candlelight vigils multiplied in Fort Valley, Macon, and even on other college campuses. Students began sharing the hashtag #HawkJusticeForAnitra, demanding accountability and greater awareness of domestic violence among young adults. Inside the sheriff's office, detectives knew the digital evidence could make or break the case. They coordinated with the Army Criminal Investigation Division, CID, since Little was an active duty soldier. Military investigators shared access to his movements and communications around the time of the murder. The collaboration between civilian and military authorities added layers of precision to the case. By early March, prosecutors felt confident enough to proceed. The Peach County District Attorney's Office filed formal murder charges, citing overwhelming evidence of premeditation and concealment. At the press conference announcing the indictment, Sheriff Dees spoke carefully. "This case touched everyone involved. We lost a bright young woman and we owe her and her family the truth. The investigation continues, but we are confident in the path we've taken." Even as the legal process moved forward, unanswered questions lingered. Had there been warning signs that were missed? Could intervention have prevented her death? Many pointed to the earlier incident, the property damage and police report that resulted in DeMarcus's first arrest, as a missed opportunity for stronger protective measures. Her father echoed that sentiment in later interviews. If the system had stepped in when she called for help, maybe she'd still be here, he said. Meanwhile, the GBI continued testing every shred of evidence, trace DNA, fibers, digital timestamps, to ensure a watertight case. They knew defense attorneys would challenge every finding, and in a case built largely on forensic and circumstantial evidence, precision was everything. By spring 2020, the investigation entered its final phase, case reconstruction. Specialists digitally mapped the timeline, aligning phone data, car movements, and witness statements into a minute-by-minute sequence. What emerged was a chilling but coherent picture, one that would later stand at the center of court proceedings. For Anitra's loved ones, though, no amount of detail could ease the ache. Her father remained steadfast at every court appearance, wearing a shirt that read, "Forever 23." The family continued to advocate for victims of domestic violence, urging young people to speak up about signs of control or abuse before it escalated. The investigation into Anitra Gunn's death was both meticulous and deeply human. Behind every lab report and every interview transcript were people who had refused to let her name become another statistic. And though detectives had pieced together a compelling narrative, one haunting question still remained. After the truth was uncovered and the evidence aligned, what moment finally broke through? What detail convinced investigators they had enough to make the arrest and seek justice? For days, investigators pored over evidence that seemed both abundant and elusive. They had Anitra's car, her phone records, a rough window of time, and a community full of theories. But what they didn't have yet, what no one had, was that one undeniable thread that could tie everything together. That moment came when technology and persistence finally met face-to-face with truth. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's crime lab in Macon received priority handling of every piece of evidence recovered from the wooded area off Greer Road and from Anitra's abandoned Chevrolet Cruze. Forensic teams examined fibers, soil samples, and digital forensics with urgency. The emotional weight behind the lab work was palpable. This wasn't just another case file. It was the loss of a 23-year-old student, someone with promise, and a family whose hope had turned into heartbreak overnight. Among the first breakthroughs came from Anitra's cell phone records. Investigators noticed something unusual. Her phone had last pinged near Greer Road in Crawford County, precisely the location where her body was found. That connection immediately narrowed the investigative timeline. When compared with tower data from others in her social circle, one phone appeared again and again within the same radius, DeMarcus Little's. Detectives began retracing Anitra's final hours using both technology and witness statements. Friends recalled seeing her the evening of February 13th. One friend told investigators that Anitra had stopped by their house briefly. She appeared calm, collected, and didn't hint that anything was wrong. But that was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. By February 14th, when messages and calls from her family went unanswered, suspicions grew. Those who knew Anitra well pointed investigators toward one name, the person she'd been trying to distance herself from, a man with whom the relationship had grown strained, DeMarcus Little, a soldier stationed at Fort Gordon. While police initially hesitated to focus too quickly on him, circumstances soon made it impossible not to. During interviews, Little told authorities that he hadn't seen Anitra after the 13th, but inconsistencies began to surface almost immediately. He mentioned details that investigators hadn't released publicly, and his timeline wavered when questioned about his movements between Fort Valley and Crawford County. Officers noted his nervous demeanor and a series of phone calls made around the critical window, calls that abruptly stopped just as Anitra's phone went dark. Then came the most striking piece of evidence yet: damage to Anitra's car. The front bumper, found in a ditch not far from her home, had scratches and material transfer that matched damage seen on Little's vehicle. When investigators compared the two, the pattern was unmistakable, as though the cars had come into contact at some point, perhaps during an argument or chase. It was the first physical link tying him to the disappearance. Detectives obtained a search warrant for Little's home. What they found deepened their suspicions. Inside, forensic specialists discovered fibers consistent with those found in Anitra's vehicle, and minor traces of blood on a windowsill that were sent for testing. While not all results were immediately conclusive, the pattern of circumstantial evidence began to form a devastating picture. Meanwhile, Anitra's friends and classmates were vocal on social media, demanding answers and pressing for accountability. The community's grief had shifted into frustration. Vigils turned into calls for justice. For detectives, public pressure only strengthened their resolve to bring clarity and closure to the Gunn family. Behind closed doors, the GBI team reviewed hours of surveillance footage from around Fort Valley, including street cameras near Anitra's residence. Late-night clips showed a vehicle matching Little's near her home around the time she vanished. Combined with tower data, it positioned him in proximity during crucial moments investigators believed Anitra was abducted or killed. On February 18, 2020, just 4 days after her body was discovered, investigators made their move. DeMarcus Little was arrested on unrelated charges of criminal damage to property, specifically vandalizing Anitra's car days before she went missing. But as evidence from the homicide investigation continued to mount, those lesser charges would soon evolve into something much more serious. The press learned of the arrest almost immediately. News cameras surrounded the Peach County Sheriff's Office as officials confirmed that the suspect already in custody was now being questioned in connection with Anitra Gunn's murder. For the first time, the community sensed that the fog of uncertainty might finally begin to lift. Forensic results trickled back from the lab in the following days. While full DNA confirmation was pending, a combination of digital data, vehicle damage correlation, and witness statements painted a compelling narrative for investigators. By the end of the month, the GBI announced that sufficient probable cause existed to charge DeMarcus Little with malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. The news spread quickly across Georgia and far beyond. For Anitra's family, the arrest was a bittersweet relief. It meant movement toward justice, but it also meant confronting the reality that the man accused of taking her life was someone she had once trusted. Her father, Christopher Gunn, expressed his gratitude to the investigators and the community, saying that although nothing could bring his daughter back, knowing someone was being held accountable gave them at least a moment of peace. As the investigation shifted toward prosecution, authorities released additional findings. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Anitra had died of manual strangulation, and that her body showed signs consistent with being moved after death. These findings not only matched the timeline investigators had constructed, but also reinforced their theory that the crime had been personal and intentional. For the Peach County Sheriff's Office and GBI agents, this was the breakthrough they had worked tirelessly for: a convergence of technology, persistence, and human determination. Each new discovery had peeled back another layer of the mystery until what was left was a picture both tragic and clear. And yet, for those closest to Anitra, the sense of resolution was only partial. The question still lingered. Why? Why would someone who claimed to love her end her life so brutally? That question, the one no investigation could truly answer, would remain with them through every court date, every anniversary, and every memory of who she once was. As the headlines spread across Georgia, the community that had come together in grief began to rally around a single purpose: justice for Anitra Gunn. The arrest brought a measure of closure, but the road ahead, the court process, the legal battles, and the search for emotional peace was just beginning. After weeks of uncertainty, the case had finally broken open. The man at the center of suspicion was now behind bars, facing charges that could put him away for life. Investigators had done their part, and the torch was now passing to the courts. But for those who had followed Anitra's story from the very beginning, one question echoed in every heart across Fort Valley. After all those months of searching, testing, and heartbreak, was this truly the moment justice had begun? The moment investigators announced that DeMarcus Little was being charged with the murder of Anitra Gunn, a hush fell over Fort Valley. For days, the town had been frozen in collective grief and uncertainty, waiting for a sign that the nightmare might finally move toward justice. Now, that sign had come, though its arrival carried a heavy kind of relief, the kind that doesn't erase pain but only makes it real. On February 25, 2020, Georgia Bureau of Investigation officials held a press conference confirming that Little faced charges of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault in connection to Anitra's death. The announcement came only a week after her body had been discovered, a rare, swift development in a homicide case, signaling the strength of the evidence gathered. Sheriff Terry Dees of Peach County stood before the cameras, the fatigue visible on his face. Behind him, a GBI representative detailed how the weeks of investigation, interviews, and forensic testing had led to a unified conclusion. They believed that DeMarcus Little, the man once trusted by Anitra, had ended her life. The words were measured, the tone deliberate, but the weight behind them was immense. For the Gunn family, hearing that announcement brought a moment of stillness. Her father, Christopher Gunn, had stood before reporters only days earlier, his voice trembling as he thanked volunteers who had joined the search for his daughter. Now, he faced the man accused of killing her, not in person yet, but through the reality of a name printed on a charge sheet. In the small courtroom of the Peach County Magistrate Court, Little's first appearance was tense and brief. Dressed in a standard-issue jumpsuit, he stood before the judge as the charges were read aloud. He spoke little, his responses quiet, almost inaudible. The press, packed tightly in the back rows, captured every second. The community that had once seen him as just another young man now saw him as the central figure in one of Georgia's most heartbreaking crimes in recent memory. Investigators continued to release limited details, but what was known painted a clear picture of motive and opportunity. While Anitra had reportedly tried to distance herself from Little, their relationship had remained strained. Witnesses told investigators that arguments had become more frequent, that she had confided in friends about wanting to move on. The discovery of her car's bumper, previously vandalized and tied to Little, became an important indicator of escalating tension before her disappearance. By early March 2020, the story had spread beyond Fort Valley. State and national outlets began to cover the case, focusing on the broader implications. A young black woman, a promising student, whose life had been cut short, and the justice system now called upon to deliver accountability. For many, Anitra's story became symbolic of both the tragedy of domestic violence and the strength of families who refused to let victims be forgotten. As prosecutors built their case, Little was transferred to the Peach County Jail without bond. Court documents revealed the mounting evidence against him, the cell tower records placing him near the disposal site, the car damage analysis, and testimony from those close to the couple. Investigators made clear that the case against him wasn't circumstantial, it was structural, built from both science and witness corroboration. Inside Fort Valley State University, memorial services continued. Students wore ribbons in Anitra's honor, and professors spoke openly about her intelligence and kindness. Her memory had already begun to transcend the courtroom. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a reminder that no matter how small the town or how young the victim, their story deserved truth and closure. Yet, for all the progress, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 slowed the legal process to a crawl. Courtrooms across Georgia closed temporarily. Hearings were postponed, grand juries delayed. For the Gunn family, it meant reliving their grief for far longer than they should have had to. Justice, they knew, would not be swift, but it would come. Throughout that period, prosecutors worked meticulously to ensure that when the case did go to trial, it would stand on irrefutable grounds. They reconstructed the timeline, bringing in digital forensic experts, phone analysts, and behavioral specialists. They sought to establish that Anitra's death was the culmination of a volatile relationship that had turned deadly, When the courts resumed regular sessions, preliminary hearings confirmed that the state intended to seek life imprisonment for Little if convicted. Prosecutors outlined the evidence trail to the judge, not in sensational terms but in a steady, methodical way. The physical link between the vehicles, the overlapping cell data, the eyewitness who had last seen Anitra alive, the recovered fibers and lab analysis. Defense attorneys countered, suggesting the state lacked direct evidence tying Little to the act itself. No eyewitness to the killing, no conclusive DNA linking him to the scene. But investigators had already pieced together what they considered an undeniable narrative: that Anitra's final moments occurred after a confrontation with someone she trusted, someone whose proximity to the evidence was far too consistent to be coincidence. As the case moved forward, the emotional toll on the community deepened. Candlelight vigils now mixed remembrance with resilience. Murals went up near the Fort Valley campus, bright, colorful tributes showing Anitra's smile. Her story had become part of the city's fabric. Every February since her death, students and residents gathered to walk in her honor, vowing to keep her name alive. In the media, Anitra's case joined a national conversation about violence against women, particularly young women of color whose stories too often went underreported. Activists and organizations cited her case when calling for stronger domestic violence awareness and intervention programs on college campuses across the South. What had started as a tragedy was becoming a movement for awareness and prevention. The wheels of justice, though slow, kept turning. Prosecutors maintained their focus. Each hearing was another step closer to resolution. Little remained in custody, awaiting the trial that would decide his fate. Though the trial itself had yet to reach verdict stage, the official charges and the weight of evidence left little doubt about where the truth pointed. For Anitra's father, the path forward was one of faith and endurance. "We'll see this through," he told a local reporter outside the courthouse, "because that's what she deserves, to be seen, to be remembered, and to have justice done." The people of Fort Valley echoed that sentiment. The case had reshaped how the community viewed safety, relationships, and the need to speak up when someone seemed in danger. Churches organized educational events. Fort Valley State implemented new support programs for students dealing with relationship or domestic concerns. Anitra's name became synonymous with both loss and change. As months turned into years, updates on the case remained steady but careful. Court proceedings were occasionally delayed, appeals filed, evidence motions debated. But the underlying truth, that investigators had identified the person responsible and the system was working toward accountability, remained constant. The trial phase, when it arrived, was expected to be both painful and healing, a public confrontation between memory and justice. The evidence, prosecutors promised, would speak louder than words. When reporters revisited the Gunn family for updates, their message was consistent. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about remembrance, ensuring that their daughter's story wasn't another headline, but a legacy that would save others. They described her not as a victim, but as a bright, kind young woman who had loved life, her friends, and her dreams of building a future rooted in creativity and community. In the courtroom, every photograph, every piece of evidence, and every timeline point stood as both fact and tribute. The case had moved from open investigation to active prosecution, the strongest step toward closure the Gunn family could have asked for. And as proceedings continued, Fort Valley watched, not with anger anymore, but with quiet resolve. They had seen what justice looked like in progress, imperfect, slow, but determined. Justice had finally arrived, but for those who waited, closure felt both healing and heartbreaking. The courtroom had long fallen silent by the time Fort Valley began to breathe again. The flashing lights, the police tape, the endless news vans that once crowded the quiet streets had all vanished. Yet, for those who loved Anitra Gunn, the silence left behind was almost louder. It filled the spaces where laughter once lived, the sound of her keys jingling as she came home, the way she would hum to herself while studying in her small apartment, the warmth that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. For weeks after her death, grief hung heavy over Fort Valley State University. Students walked slower. Professors paused longer before lectures. The campus, once buzzing with conversation and optimism, carried a stillness that felt foreign. It wasn't just the loss of a classmate, it was the loss of a spirit that had brightened so many lives. A year later, in early 2021, the university dedicated a quiet corner of campus to her memory. There, a small garden was planted beside the agriculture building where she once studied. Rows of azaleas and white lilies surrounding a bronze plaque that bears her name. Each spring, those flowers bloom in waves of soft color, drawing students who never met her to stop and read her story. For many, it's the first time they learn who Anitra Gunn was and why her memory continues to shape the community she left behind. Professors who taught her described her as driven, humble, and deeply kind. She had an eye for detail, often staying after class to ask thoughtful questions or help organize group projects. Friends said she loved nature and found peace in working with her hands, fitting for someone pursuing a degree in agricultural science. Her world revolved around family, her father, and her close circle of friends. They spoke of her laughter, her quiet determination, and her ability to comfort others even when she was facing challenges of her own. In the months that followed her passing, those closest to her transformed their grief into advocacy. Her name began appearing on flyers, awareness walks, and student-led campaigns urging young people to recognize the early signs of abuse. In Fort Valley and across Georgia, conversations that had long been whispered began taking place in public about control, manipulation, and the hidden face of domestic violence. The Georgia Commission on Family Violence later cited Anitra's case as a catalyst for renewed engagement among college communities. Workshops were developed across several universities to help students identify patterns of coercion and emotional abuse. Hotlines and crisis counselors were introduced on more campuses, and survivor networks began forming among students determined to protect one another. These changes were not the result of sweeping government mandates, but of human will, the determination of a grieving community that refused to let her death fade quietly into statistics. One student who helped organize the first campus forum said during an interview, "We're doing this because she was one of us. Because if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. And if her story can save even one person, then she's still making a difference." That spirit of purpose turned pain into momentum. In local churches and town halls, family members and advocates began hosting open discussions about relationship boundaries, communication, and self-worth. Survivors shared their stories for the first time, many admitting that they once stayed silent because they didn't believe anyone would listen. Anitra's story gave them permission to speak, and in doing so, it began to heal others too. At Fort Valley's annual homecoming weekend, a new tradition emerged. Before the festivities begin, a candlelight vigil is held at the Memorial Garden. Dozens of candles flicker in the wind as the sun sets over campus. Students, alumni, and townspeople gather in quiet unity, the sound of the choir softly echoing across the field. Some who attend never knew Anitra personally, but they come because her story has become part of the school's collective identity, a reminder of the importance of care, vigilance, and compassion. Anitra's father, who has spoken at several of these gatherings, often repeats one message: love should never hurt. If you feel afraid in love, speak up. If you see someone struggling, reach out. His words have since been quoted in articles, shared on social media, and printed on banners at awareness events. Each time, they bring back the humanity at the heart of this tragedy, the idea that silence and fear must never be allowed to coexist with love. Over time, her story began to transcend Fort Valley. Local artists painted murals across Middle Georgia, depicting her surrounded by peach blossoms, a symbol of growth, resilience, and Georgia's enduring beauty. These murals aren't grand or ostentatious. They're quiet tributes, tucked between storefronts or on the walls of small community centers. They remind passers-by that even in grief, there can be grace. As the years passed, Anitra's legacy also influenced broader conversations about how missing person cases are handled in the U.S., particularly those involving young women of color. Advocates and journalists noted that many similar cases often go unnoticed or underreported until community activism forces attention. Anitra's case showed that when a community stands together, visibility and accountability follow. Her name became a rallying point, not for outrage, but for awareness. Meanwhile, the legal process continued its course: appeals, hearings, filings, the slow machinery of justice turning long after headlines had moved on. Yet, for those who loved her, the outcome of those proceedings could never undo what had been lost. Justice, to them, wasn't about punishment alone. It was about recognition, remembrance, and ensuring that her life, her story, was not reduced to a case file. At the heart of every memorial, every vigil, every whispered prayer for Anitra, there lies a lesson that extends far beyond Georgia. It is the lesson that tragedy often leaves behind, that awareness is not just an act of empathy, but of prevention. Her story has inspired countless young women and men to examine their own relationships, to talk openly about boundaries, and to trust their instincts. In that sense, her light continues to guide others away from danger and toward safety. Fort Valley State University now holds an annual scholarship award in her honor, given to students studying agricultural sciences who demonstrate both academic excellence and community service, the very values she embodied. Each year, the recipient stands before a small crowd and accepts the award in her name, often with tears in their eyes, recognizing that they carry forward her unfinished dreams. When the campus quiets each evening and the wind rustles through the garden she inspired, it feels as if her presence still lingers, in the laughter of students, the hum of classrooms, the strength of a community that refuses to forget. Anitra Gunn's story is more than a tragedy. It's a testament to the resilience of memory and the power of community. Through her, we are reminded that behind every case number lies a life filled with hope, ambition, and love. She was a daughter, a student, a friend, and a light that continues to shine through those she left behind. Her story teaches us that justice is not just found in courtrooms. It's in the awareness we spread, the compassion we share, and the voices we raise for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Before we end, share your thoughts in the comments. What lessons do you think Anitra's case leaves behind? Could greater awareness and intervention help prevent tragedies like this in the future? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the search for justice and the untold stories behind each case. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more revealed crime stories, and we'll see you in the next one.